Welcome, everyone. My name is Martin Jean. I'm director of the Institute of Sacred Music here at Yale University. We are an interdisciplinary graduate center here for the study and practice of sacred music, worship, and the related arts. Great pleasure to welcome all of you and all of our distinguished panelists today. This four-part series on caring for the dying and the dead in the time of COVID has been a long, sinuous conversation that both implicates and interrogates our theologies and practices around the end of life. COVID has forced these and so many other questions on us, and we will be left with many, many new areas to explore in the years to come. While today's session is not by any means meant to end this conversation, it is, we hope, a time to ask theological questions based on what we've experienced in caring for those who are dying, memorializing those who have died, and thinking about our current situation in relation to past practices. As usual, we are led in these conversations by our moderator, Dr. Thomas Long, the Bandy, Professor Emeritus of Preaching at the Candler School of Theology, Emory University, and author of the book, Accompany Them with Singing, The Christian Funeral. He will introduce our other distinguished panelists in a moment, and about halfway through, we will invite all of you to use the Q&A function on your screen to submit your comments and questions, and we hope that you will take an opportunity to do that today. And we'll get to as many of those as we have time for. And you can see more details about today's session on our website at ism.yale.edu. Without further ado, one final time, here's Dr. Thomas Long.
Thanks, Martin. I am Tom Long. It's been my great pleasure to moderate these 4 webinars. This is the last of the series, and so I think it's appropriate today to thank the Yale ISM. They are the ones who've sponsored this, who've made it possible. Their marvelous director, Martin Jean, and their assistant to the director, Kristen Foreman, and the program manager who's helped us with technology, Evan Graves, and all the others who have done such marvelous work in getting these webinars organized. If you don't know about the Yale ISM, you should check their website. They are a great resource, a lot to offer, and including recordings of these webinars, which will be available on their website. In our first webinar, we talked about accompanying people in the process of dying. In the second webinar, we talked about changes in funeral and memorial service rituals of death. In the third seminar, we had historians come in and talk about previous pandemics, the London plague of 1675, the 1918 flu pandemic, what we've learned from the past. Today, we're going into the deep end of the pool, and we're going to be asking, how has COVID-19 deepened and challenged us theologically to think in different ways and in deeper old ways? In my preaching classes, when we get around to talking about the funeral homily, I tell the class, if you're preaching at a funeral, you should know that there are 2 preachers at every funeral. There's you, and there's capital D death. Little d death is biological death. It sometimes comes as a friend, but capital D death is the final enemy, and it never comes as a friend. Capital D death comes to every funeral and loves to preach. And the sermon is always the same. Damn all of you. I break all community. I violate all relationships of love. The victory is mine. And it is our duty and delight to stand there and shake our fist in the face of capital D death and to give a counter witness. Now, sometimes those of us who are caretakers of those who are dying and those who are grieving talk about a ministry of presence. We are not there to explain things sometimes when people are in deep grief, but we are there to be present, to comfort. And that's true. Ministry of presence is a powerful ministry. But sometimes the time comes when we need to speak because questions of meaning arise. Theological issues come up, questions about the character of God. And those of us who are close to those suffering need to be able to speak. And that's what we want to explore today. Where is Christ present? Where is God active in the midst of this suffering? One of my friends told me that there was a photograph in the newspaper that moved her very much. It was an ICU nurse. It was last summer in the midst of the COVID worst part. She was taking her short break from her shift, and she was still in her scrubs and seated at her computer. She had a medicine cup filled with a little wine and a scrap of bread. And she was online to participate in the Eucharist with her church. I mention that not to raise issues of sacramental theology, but to raise issues that that nurse was thinking about. Where in the midst of this is God present, and how is God healing and active? We've got 4 theologians as panelists today. Our first panelist is the Reverend Michael Lewis, who is a parochial vicar in El Paso, Texas, at St. Mark's Catholic Church. And he is also, for his diocese, a trainer of priests in issues of pastoral care and liturgy. And Mike, we're glad to have you back. Those of you who've seen the other webinars know Mike's face. We're glad to have you back for this one, Mike.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you also to the Yale ISM. It really is an honor and a privilege and a humbling experience to be included in all of this. You know, what we're talking about today after the other 3 sessions is bringing it back to God and bringing it back to God's presence. And my experience during this pandemic has been one that has upended our traditional, sort of the traditional theology that surrounds not only our rights for the sick and the dying, but also the rights, our funeral rights for the dead. And part of that, a lot of that is because the 2 main focuses of our funeral rites in my tradition, which are spiritual aid to the dead, but also this consolation of hope for the living. There's a barrier for many people and loved ones because they feel an estrangement from God because of the suffering that they've endured themselves, watching a loved one become sick and then die of this terrible illness. Also a sort of them feeling a sorrow for their loved one for having gone through this experience. So there's this estrangement from God that I've seen quite a bit that is expressed in various ways. For example, it could be they don't want the chaplain there when the person is dying because it's a way of them showing their anger to God, you know, and I'm sort of the representative of God in that moment. And, you know, and there's nothing I can do in that moment in order to relieve their grief as much as I want to. And it certainly isn't the moment to give them a theological treatise, you know, on really what's going on here. But what it is, and in many cases, is what the overall theme of this entire series has been. It's accompanying the dead and dying and those who mourn, accompanying them, being there, yes, as a representative for God in some situations, but also being there to help them see the face of God, not necessarily in ourselves, but even in the midst of the suffering, even in the midst of the hope, again, that consolation of hope for those of us who remain. This part of, you know, the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, I mean, that could be its own webinar series, I'm sure. But when it comes to this particular instance, here's some of the ways that I've seen it sort of express itself. Not only have I, you know, basically the chaplain has been kicked out of the room in the hospital because they don't want to think about God in that moment. They're angry at God in that moment. We've also seen it when it comes to the actual funeral rites. In many cases, they're delayed because of logistical problems due to the pandemic, whether it's embalming or cremating the remains. But then there's a sort of a malaise, a sort of a sadia that develops where people are not, it's like, God wasn't there for me in my moment of grief, so why should I care about doing anything now with God? We see it with a truncation of the funeral rites into something that is like good enough. We see it also in people maintaining or holding on to the remains, the cremains of their loved ones. The overwhelming number, most of the victims of COVID, at least here in El Paso, were cremated because there was no space for embalming or the traditional forms of preserving the body. So what we're seeing a lot is people just holding on to the cremains. And obviously in our tradition, that's not permitted for many reasons. But also it's sort of, again, it's their way of expressing that estrangement that I was talking about. So the question comes, how do we as ministers bridge that gap? How do we as ministers accompany these people and help them connect with the God that they are angry with, saddened with, estranged from? And again, we should have a whole other series on that. But I think what we need to remember is that as much as we want to remove their pain, there is a way for them to contact God through that pain. And I think there's a way also for us to try to minimize the mourning process too, or to say things that aren't necessarily theologically true, but sound and are sort of a balm that help people get through their grief or through that immediate moment of awkwardness or of anger, of pain. We as humans, I think, and as ministers, we're all sort of wired to try to do whatever we can to alleviate whatever the person's suffering in front of us. But sometimes I think that suffering is needed for them in order to freely and truly come to an understanding, a theological truth about where our hope, where our prayer says that this person is now. That is what we are praying for. And I think it's good too to look at the two different axes here of theological axes when it comes to the funeral rites, that spiritual aid to the dead. Sometimes I've found that focusing on that helps the people get over their grief by saying, let's pray for this loved one. Let's pray for this loved one. It helps them to get over that sense of, well, God didn't listen to me before. Why is he going to hear me now? And I always just say, you don't know that, and I don't know that. So let's try. Let's try. That often is a bridge that helps them really truly feel that that they are I hate to use the term, but useful in a godly sense to help their loved one who has passed. But then the consolation of hope for the living. When it comes to that, this is where the danger is to say cheap platitudes that are just designed to get out of an awkward situation. But I think there's great meaning in our theological truths of what we truly believe that this all is all about, that our participation in these funeral rites is, in some sense, it's an expression of our belief in the Paschal mystery. It's our belief that Jesus suffered and died for a reason, and that Jesus opened the doors of death, broke the bonds of death, and was victorious over death in his resurrection. And helping people to make an understanding to that, to use a line from one of our prefaces for Eucharistic prayers for the dead, and that is that life is changed, not ended. That, I think, has been the most powerful thing I know for myself in getting through this, ministering to the minister, meaning me, but also to help those who are grieving the most, who are in so much pain in all of this. The ultimate point is, as we accompany the dead and the dying, is to help them connect with Christ. Granted, not all of us are Christians who are participating in this panel. I can only speak for my tradition, not just for the Christian tradition as a whole, but for my particular part of that Christian tradition, which is Roman Catholicism. But that, I think, that hope of the resurrection is ultimately what I find is the most helpful in helping people through their grief, helping people through their sadness. This is, again, this is a topic that covers a lot of other topics. It sort of branches out like an octopus. But, you know, in many cases, I've seen it also introduce some great conversations with people. And I found people over time, with the blessing and the balm of time, to find their way back to God, because they are somehow spurned by this experience, and they return back to the church that they were so angry at, or they return back to having conversations with God, which they railed at once upon a time. And in those moments, that's the sort of aftercare that we still need to remember. We are called to be accompaniment, to accompany, I can't do English right now, but to accompany those in those moments of grief and pain, which don't always end at the end of the funeral. So I know my colleagues, my learned colleagues, have other facets of this to look at, but at least those are my reflections, having been in the thick of this, not only as a minister to the sick and dying, but certainly as a minister to in funeral rites, especially for those who have passed because of this pandemic.
I lost my internet. We had a thunderstorm go through, so I'm not sure where we are. Michael, have you finished your presentation?
I just did, and you missed what was probably the best thing that you ever missed and heard everywhere else. I mean, I heard clapping, so.
Well, what I did here was marvelous, and we'll come back around to some of the things that you were saying. Our second panelist is Don DeVries, who is the Thomas Professor of Systematic Theology at the Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. She's published a marvelous book on the preaching of Jesus Christ in Calvin and Schleiermacher, and she's busily at work editing the New Westminster Dictionary of Christian Theology. Dr. DeVries, we are delighted to have you with us today.
Thanks, Tom. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale. It's a great honor to be part of this webinar. I'm a systematic theologian, and people often joke about us being very interested in topics that are of no kind of pastoral or earthly use. I hope that's not true, but I'm going to take this in a little different direction. We are living in really apocalyptic times, I think it's fair to say. And the pandemic is one aspect of that, but across the country, we've had record heat waves already, and it's only July 1st today. We have wildfires starting in the West that are looking to add up again to the sort of record proportions. We have Arctic melt and a lot of anxiety about climate change and things like that. So people have a feeling that we're living in the end of the world. It's a frightening time, and it's a time when people are very vulnerable to all kinds of conspiracy theories and questions and expectations. And I think that the time and the issues that are presented by our admittedly apocalyptic times are inviting us to think in new ways about the doctrine of creation, of all things. When I talk about the doctrine of creation, as a theologian, we don't look at that so much as a story about how the world got started, but rather about the way that we thematize the relationship between God and the world and ourselves. And I think that this has been undergoing some transformation all through the 20th century and into the 21st century. So traditionally, the Christian doctrine of creation has underlined the fact that God is utterly different than the world. And it has also tended, based partly on a reading of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, to highlight the distinctiveness of our species, of Homo sapiens, of human beings, as opposed to everything else in the world. And particularly, it has tended to make us feel really special So the doctrine of the image of God in human beings seems to suggest that there's something about us that makes us utterly different than anything else and really, really important. And that's all probably still true. We can talk about what that means in another moment. But I think if you read in the history of Christian thought, what this has done is to lead to a kind of human hubris almost in relation to the rest of the created order, where we think we're the ones who are special. We're the ones that Christ was incarnated as a human being, and God is very much committed to the human project more than anything else. And it's almost as if all the rest of the world, the earth and all its inhabitants are kind of a background to the drama of human redemption. Now, there's a kind of old article now that came out, I think, in the 1970s or so by a man called Lynn White that argues that it was precisely these kind of attitudes that set us up for the ecological crisis. And I don't know if that's true or false. I think there's probably some truth in it, probably deserves a little criticism too, but theologians have been thinking about the way we thematize the God-world-human relationship, and we're starting to wonder whether it's a little oversimplified in the older traditional ways of thinking about this. And I've been thinking about this a lot in relation to COVID, because I think what we've learned is, however we think of ourselves as a species, we're not separate from everything else, and we can't separate ourselves from everything else that is and exists on this planet. Everything from the smallest, a virus, not even a living thing, a pathogen that enters our body like rogue computer code, all kinds of microorganisms, all kinds of insects, all kinds of other animals. We're related to all of it. And we're also related to each other across the lines of division that we often love to highlight as human beings. I mean, we're really good at finding in-groups and out-groups. And we tend to think of ourselves in terms of those groups. So another aspect I think that we've been dealing with in the US in recent times, and really across the world, this is happening, is a kind of renewed xenophobia, renewed ethno-nationalism, and sort of identifying with our group. And so one of the things that was shocking, I think, existentially shocking about COVID virus is that we were reading in the newspaper, at least I was, in January of 2020, about a new respiratory virus observed in Wuhan, China. That seems like the other side of the world. It seems very far away. And it seems like it was something kind of, interesting, but it doesn't matter to me. And 2 months later, it closed down everything in the United States of America. And here we are a year and a half later with more than 600,000 American citizens dead from this virus that seemed like it was very far away, happening to people very far removed from us. And I think that just very viscerally drove home the point that we're all connected. The world is not a kind of collection of separate individuals, but it's a kind of interconnected web in which everything relates to everything else, and we can't separate ourselves from each other. And I think this is really an important transformation in the way that we think about ourselves in relation to each other as other humans, and also in relation to the rest of the world, because we can't afford to treat planet Earth or any of the other creatures or our fellow human beings as the mere backdrop to our personal relationship with God, or the personal dramas with God that we may be engaged in our religious piety. And then let me just say, it also, I think, raises a question whether we need to think about how God relates to all of this a little differently than we used to. Because I think on the old model of classical theism, you picture God kind of like a human agent standing outside of our universe or our cosmos and acting on it from the outside, maybe selectively, not all the time, but occasionally. So, you know, the very question, where was God in this, suggests that maybe God wasn't present. I think in the model of the doctrine of creation that I'm suggesting to you, theologians would say God is present in every single thing that happens, including all the bad things, which we could talk about that in a minute. But God is less like an agent acting on the planet or on the cosmos from outside of it selectively, doing one thing and maybe not doing another thing, but more like the power of life and creativity pulsing through the universe and drawing it forward from where it is now to the next moment, to the next moment, to the next moment. What I'm describing roughly, for those of you who may have studied some theology, is more like a process theology understanding of God's relation to the world. But I think that's gaining purchase outside of small groups of philosophical theologians, because it's more descriptive of how we observe our world than some of the older models. And I think it really can help us to develop a new kind of piety and a new sense of commitment to each other across the lines that we often use to separate ourselves from others or from the animal species. Another reason that I think about this is just that from what we're beginning to learn about, all coronaviruses are zoonotic in origin, which means they came from other animals than the human animal. And some of them we have been exposed to, and therefore we're now vulnerable to these coronaviruses. But this particular virus probably came to us from bats. And you think, bats? Who cares about bats? And the fact of the matter is, a lot of the reason that these coronaviruses are beginning to skip into the human race more frequently is because we are disturbing the habitat of wildlife in other parts of the world where they used to be able to live their wild lives without human encroachment and without our being interfered with by them very much. So I think those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. And I think it does invite us to look at the question of God and evil a little bit differently, maybe. And I'd be happy to talk about that more. But I do feel like it's not wrong to say that in some way we're experiencing God's judgment on some kinds of human behavior, not in the sense of a being, like a human-like being standing outside and selectively inflicting punishments, but really just that built in to this highly interconnected web of existence that we all inhabit on our little blue planet are consequences that will happen when certain boundaries are pushed or when certain actions are taken. And God doesn't step in and prevent us from those consequences falling, painful as it may be. And I think the question for us, or for me, I think really is, are we going to learn what we need to learn from the present moment so that we can be wiser and more attentive to God's beautiful, creative, and just and peaceful intentions for our world, and work with those rather than somewhat proudly trying to defy the limits. So that's where I'd like to start, but I have many other thoughts as well.
Wow, yeah, you've already given us a rich canvas of ideas about how COVID has challenged and changed our theological thinking. And I want to come back a little bit later to talk more about your beautiful revisioning of the category of God's judgment. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But now our third panelist is Kevin Park, Reverend Dr. Kevin Park. He also is a systematic theologian. He taught at Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta and ran the Doctor of Ministry program there. He is now back in the parish. He is at a strong and influential parish in Atlanta, the Korean Central Presbyterian Church. Kevin, we're glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Tom. Allow me to share a personal ministry anecdote. I don't know if this really fits into the theme, but we'll see. So some years back, when I was a much younger pastor, I worked at a Korean Presbyterian church in Bloomfield, New Jersey, where I was in charge of the mostly second generation Korean American English speaking folks under the rubric of the larger first generation Korean speaking congregation. Well, the English speaking folks grew in number and in age. And with the blessing of the Korean session, about 50 young Korean American members moved to a small declining Presbyterian church just about 1.5 miles away after much planning and prayer. So this church, a shout out to Bethany Presbyterian Church in Bloomfield, New Jersey. So this Bethany Presbyterian Church began just before the Second World War and thrived in the decades following the war. But by the time we moved in, which, by the way, we moved in by transfer of membership, about 50 of us, the congregation had about a dozen faithful members in their 70s and 80s, all of them white Americans, and they really welcomed us. They were very happy to have us, and we were happy to have a church of our own. But soon, both groups realized that second generation Korean Americans in their 20s and 30s had little in common with white Americans born in the 1920s and the 30s. Inevitably, there were challenges and tensions. Phrases like, we want to do this, but we always did it this way, were not uncommon, as well as words like us and them were used by both groups. It was kind of tough going for a while. But then something unexpected happened. I started to do funerals for the first time. A lot of funerals, because there were many. So we call the original members of Bethany Church affectionately Bethanites, and shout out to Bethanites. There were some of the Bethanite members of the church who were shut-ins, along with those original Bethanites who came to church weekly. And as members died, there were funerals. And soon, few of the original members who were active weekly worship leaders and musicians also died. And for many of the young Korean folks, this was their very first experience of witnessing deaths of folks they saw weekly and knew well. So we had funerals where young Korean Americans and older white Americans wept and grieved together. And that did it. Through funerals, through weeping, through weaving the stories of the deceased as part of the witness to the gospel and the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, the two very different folks became one organic community of faith. The words us and them were retired. It's something that I would have never anticipated as a young pastor. Who knew? Unexpectedly, through funerals, the Holy Spirit helped knit the two groups into one loving community of faith. I share this story because I want to introduce kind of a larger theological theme that comes from the tradition of the theology of the cross. And by theology of the cross, I don't mean atonement theories, but theology of the cross as a way of seeing the whole Christian theology through the lens of this particular tradition. And this tradition says that God is hidden and yet also revealed at the same time on the cross of Christ. In a very unexpected, but in a powerful way, God is revealed. The cross of Christ unexpectedly reveals to us the love of God for the world. So this is what I mean. Crucifixion was, as people know, the most violent method of public execution perfected by the Roman Empire to demonstrate to the world what happens to those who oppose the empire. And God is almost completely hidden in this horrendous event. Where is God in this? And yet, through faith, we can testify that the cross is the most powerful revelation of God's self-giving love to the world. It says we can reject God, we can betray God, we can mock God, we can spit on God, we can nail God on the cross to die. And even then, God says, my love for you will never diminish, not even an iota. That's powerful stuff. And the cross reveals not only God's robust, unquenchable, stubborn, relentless love for the world, but the cross also reveals and clarifies in detail the frightening systemic mechanism of human sin that results in profound human brokenness. The crucifixion of Jesus was only possible because all of the dimensions of human sin, from the personal, communal, to the religious, military, and the political realm of the empire conspired perfectly together to get the job done. The betrayals of the disciples, the police who arrested Jesus, the religious mechanism through which Jesus was tried and handed over to Pilate, who represented the empire, to the mob who shouted, crucify him, to the soldiers, part of the vast military complex of the empire, who tortured and crucified Jesus. The cross unflinchingly reveals the depth and efficient mechanism of human sin that seamlessly cooperates between very unlikely systems. So in this sense, the cross of Christ, by revealing the depth of human mechanism of sin, judges it. This tradition, of course, this is not new to me. Many theologians of the cross pointed this out, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Kazuo Kitamori, Kozuke Koyama, Jürgen Moltmann, Mary Solberg, Douglas John Hall, and others. But what the cross of Christ witnesses to is that the love of God in Jesus through the Holy Spirit is even more tenacious and resilient and powerful than the multi-dimensions of human sin just described. Indeed, God's power is the power of God's relentless self-giving love for the world. And the church is called to be the agent of this divine love. So like the cross, COVID too has revealed the dimensions of human sin and brokenness in detail, I think. COVID has revealed the fragility of human condition. Even we who live in North America, the most affluent, most technologically advanced society in history, could not solve COVID with a technological magic wand. And our society, whom the Canadian theologian Douglas John Hall described it as the officially optimistic society, can't handle the truth of human fragility that COVID has revealed. COVID has shown us the fragility of our economy as well. COVID has revealed the discrepancy in treatment and vaccine availability between wealthy superpowers and countries struggling with poverty. COVID has revealed the discrepancy of our health and economic systems that benefit the largely white wealthy against the poorer people of color. COVID has revealed the deep brokenness of the human condition. Martin Luther wrote in his Heidelberg Disputation, just 1 year after his 95 Theses, a theologian of glory calls evil good and good evil. A theologian of the cross calls the thing what it is. I think COVID gives us the opportunity to call a thing what it is. But that's not the end of the story. If the theology of the cross only remains as a method of critical theology, it remains as a theologically depressing means of diagnosis only. But the cross is not the end of the story. Cross goes deep to uncover the multi-dimension of human sin and brokenness, to reveal to us that even what the worst that the world can throw at God cannot overwhelm God's power of love. Our sinful and broken condition does not have the last say. Through the resurrection of Christ, the power of God's love is unleashed to the world through the Holy Spirit and through the churches. We are the people of God who has received the good news that whatever the cross uncovers, we can engage it with God's help and work toward healing and wholeness. The cross of Christ points to the broken places and situations. The cross of Christ points to the most unlikely places, unexpected places and people and events, and reveals to us that God is precisely there and calls us to join God. The cross of Christ points to those people and communities who are suffering because of the convergence of human sin and brokenness, and reveals that it is there that God is most powerfully present. And the people of God, the church, the body of Christ, is called to be present with them. We are called to be in solidarity with those who are suffering and downtrodden, to suffer with them in order to alleviate suffering in the name of Jesus. Because the good news of Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit is stronger and more tenacious and resilient than the sinful and broken human condition, the self-giving love of God revealed in the life, cross, and resurrection of Jesus Christ will have the last say. And we are called to be part of this awesome, ongoing divine saga. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. One of the things that you mentioned is the theology of the cross leads you to tell the truth about things, where theology of glory does not. Simply telling the truth about things has a special traction, I think, in our culture right now. And so thank you for bringing that up. Our last panelist is Khalil Williams. She is a busy woman. She is the Dean of Worship and Music at Candler School of Theology in Atlanta. She's also a professor of worship there. And in addition to that, she's an associate pastor at the Providence Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta. So she has been coming at this issue from lots of different directions. And Khalia, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Tom, for having me. And thank you to Martin, Jean, and Yale YSM for this invitation to join this esteemed panel. It's been really great, I think, to go last because I get to hear the wisdom and the fruit of my colleagues here on the panel. So Michael and Don and Kevin, thank you all for just the breadth of wisdom that you've shared and your thoughts and your experiences. It has been great hearing from each of you. So I want to enter into this conversation from this role of practitioner and liturgical educator, which is how I'm operating in any of the many spaces that I'm working in, and whether it's an formal academic setting, whether it's within my own congregational setting, or whether it is simply in a very small group setting in joining individuals along their own journeys. And so in that space, I have found, particularly during this time of COVID, that the questions are always running in my mind. The particular set of questions that are always running in my mind are often, what are we doing, right? As a liturgical leader, what are we doing? How are we doing it? Why are we doing it? And what does our doing say about God? And then how is God present in the doing? Now, that's a whole lot of set of questions to run through, but COVID has actually kind of challenged us and really forced us to reckon with these questions a whole lot more intentionally than we may have done so before. And while also doing that, it's forced us into this space of flexibility and openness to discover the new in our liturgical practices, because we couldn't just do what we had always been doing. And so those new ways of doing and those new ways of kind of being in worship and in liturgical relationship with individuals as distanced communities. So that kind of automatically gets thrust upon us. And when we have to sit in that and begin to really run our actions, our rituals, our time in community through technology, our time in isolation, through those questions, it brings us into this kind of involuntary pivot with those end of life rituals that we have, and we've had to reimagine them and creatively respond to care with individuals who are dying and their loved ones. And in so doing, I feel like we've had to think about what's really important. What's the most necessary in these times, almost a stripping down and deconstructing of our liturgical practices, and even thinking of what is at the essence, at the heart of our ritualization, and how then do we begin to understand God present in these unique circumstances. And so as practitioners and as leaders, we've had to do that reflective work for ourselves. And then we are called to walk alongside those who are dying and grieving, and pastorally, compassionately, and lovingly help them do that reflective work as well. How do we do that, right? So, and then answer the very blatant question, what is God doing? Where is God, right? And I've heard a lot more of the, what is God doing? What is happening here in those one-off conversations? And so how then do we, when I think about how we help individuals really witness God in this time and discover what God is in fact doing, I'm drawn to a number of points and ways to do it. And I'll really just hit on two for the sake of our time. And the first thing that really comes to mind for me is we do this by deepening our engagement in and our relationship with the act of lament. So how do we help people witness God in this time? We help people recognize God in their lament. And this really comes in this space of sitting with individuals and communities in their lament. Now, when I say sitting with, I am literally talking about this actively engaging individuals in their lament, not trying to push them past lament, not trying to explain the lament away, not trying to theologize it for them, but to really, truly, actively be present with individuals in their lament in a way that we are much more intentional about today than we probably would have been 24 months ago. And so how do we then think about that as we're journeying alongside them? What does that look like liturgically? To liturgically engage the realities of the physical and spiritual and emotional state of those that we're journeying alongside in their lament. What does that look like? So when I think about that, I'm thinking about funeral homilies or eulogies that clearly reflect a God who walks with us in our sorrow and in our lament, right? This is where the Psalms become so very helpful. Perfect example, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? That gets picked up, right? Even in the crucifixion story, my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. These representations of lamenting to God that also then clearly recognizes God, but you are still enthroned, right? You are enthroned in our praises, but I am still here in this lament. And so utilizing those liturgical moments to sit in and say, it's okay to ask God, where are you? Why can't I hear you? Why can't I feel you? What are you doing. I'm frustrated in this moment, right? And we don't often preach that. We don't preach, God, I'm mad right now. We move past that, particularly speaking out of my own cultural tradition. So I'm out of the Black Baptist Church, and we are, so, you know, homiletics in the Black church, preaching in the Black church is noted for celebration and this art of moving congregations into this space of celebration. And so it's this idea of deepening our engagement and our relationship in the lament before we get over to that celebration part, and then being intentional about other liturgical moments, the music that we select that speaks to God who is present and with us, and using music that connects times of personal revelation of God's activity in individual and communal life, that brings about a powerful remembering and reconnecting right in the moment. So we actually are enlivening that memory, that process for us when we're in that space. And then also just kind of thinking of other liturgies that provide us space to just be open and honest about grief in worshipful ways in community with others, that offer a sense of connectional relationship. So how do we deepen our engagement and relationship to lament by naming rituals that allow us to name and hear communal experiences, moments of sharing narratives through storytelling and testimony? That's one of the most powerful experiences I've witnessed throughout this time of COVID and transitioning into virtual worship or smaller ways of connecting, and the presence of story, the presence of just sharing the story and the testimony that just speaks to where we are, and doing it in a communal way becomes very powerful, because I think there is something powerful, informative in communal lament, particularly when it has a clear form and is expressed corporately. So it's in Emily Towns's book, I think it's Breaking the Fine Reign of Death is the book. She expresses this communal lament as really having an ability to help shape our vision of ourselves as we become more attuned with the world around us. And I would add that communal Lent not only has this ability to shape our vision of ourselves as we are aware of the world around us, but it also has this ability to help us become more aware of God's presence with us as we become more aware of the world around us, and this connectivity that we have not only to the people, but literally to God's creation. So if I can't see God moving and active here, how can I see God moving? And that communal lament does create this space for us to see that, and the opportunity for us to do that. And I think it's very important because, again, as I shared, sitting in the Black Baptist tradition, I think this idea of sitting in our lament is somewhat unspoken. And it's not just in the Black Baptist tradition. I think in many traditions that I've engaged, this idea of really, truly, intentionally engaging lament is often unspoken, or we are quickly ready to move beyond it. And even the way we frame funerals as celebrations and homegoing services, which they are, but the naming of it that way also kind of passes by and quickly pushes us past us acknowledging, reckoning with, and actively engaging our lament. And then we miss seeing God in that time and in that space of lament. So I do think that it is important for us to recognize this value and strength in communal lament, even in reimagined forms. In addition to just deepening our own engagement and relationship with, and I think it's important that I say relationship with, because lament does often become an ongoing experience. And I think if we recognize how we relate to ourselves and our communities and to God in that space and in that time of lament, it becomes important for us to really be able to move with and deepen God in our awareness and God's activity in that time. The other piece that I think is helpful is just this necessity for us to enter into our end-of-life rituals, funerals, memorials with this model, or rather a deep ethic of care. This then calls us to really revisit those questions that I brought up earlier, that I'm reading through and have been actively reading many of, I won't say every, but many of the liturgical engagement, many of the pastoral moments that I've had. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? How am I doing it? What is it saying about God? How is God present in the doing, right? Running through kind of that list of questions to even nail down what's happening in this moment, and just doing that reflective process. I think that deep ethic of care really is important. And that questioning gets me to this deep ethic of care and helps me to revisit those questions and revisit those liturgical moments in a way that really puts us in a space to continuously reimagine and reflect in critical ways upon what we're doing, which calls us then to be connected in a community in a way that's aware of not only our individual lived experiences, but forces us to be aware of the lived experiences of those that we're called to exist with in community. And when we're called then to actually understand and become very aware of those lived experiences, the individual and communal experiences, we then move to navigating our communal existence with a deep ethic of care that I think calls us to embody this spirituality of grace that gets reflected in how we relate to one another, and then cultivates an environment that allows us to witness God's presence in new and familiar ways, while also giving us the space to hold that witness of God's presence in tension with our lament, our frustration, our anger, all that we are feeling, and bring through the fullness of ourselves into these times, into the liturgical moments that are happening in these difficult times. So I could say a whole lot more, and I have a ton of other thoughts, but I am aware of time, so I think this will be a good place to pause.
Thanks, Khalia. And one quick little question. One of our participants wonders about that book title that you mentioned. It might have been Emily Towns, The Breaking of what?
That's right. It's Emily Towns, Breaking the Fine Reign of Death.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to pick up on your comments about lament, because in a way, all of you have talked about that. Dawn has talked about how COVID has taught us some things that are the themes of lament. And Michael talked about the anger toward God and the feeling of where was God? God was not there for me. And Kevin's talked about the need for authentic and honest language generated by theology of the cross. It has occurred to me that we may have exposed here a missed opportunity that the Psalms of Lament are not simply to be sung when we are in the middle of grief. They are like all of our things that we sing and say in liturgy. We dress rehearse them because we're going to need them. And so we get around to the time when we do have this deep grief, this deep anger, this sense of abandonment, and the resources are there, but we haven't practiced them. I wonder what some of you on the panel think about that. What do we need to do in our worshiping together and our pastoral care to equip people with a language that we haven't properly given them, perhaps?
I'm happy to jump in on that. So, Tom, I think you're exactly right that the Psalms of Lament are not just for us to use in those times of grief. And I think what we need to do is to incorporate them into the fabric of our liturgical life. And when we begin to do that, we begin to cultivate this relationship with laments that I mentioned earlier, right? It's not a foreign relationship. It's not something new, but I actually have heard the sound of lament. I actually have lifted the song of lament even before I got in that place of lament. So now I have a reserve to tap into the same way I know and hear the song of praise, the same way I know and am familiar with the language of praise. I think we are able to become familiar with lament. And then when we are familiar with lament, we're familiar with where God is in lament. The more we walk through, and the Psalms are the perfect place to do it, the Psalms of lament, we begin to see how the psalmists move through lament and still recognize God's activity, God's presence. So I might question, where are you, God? But by the time I get to the end of the Psalm, you're there, but I just don't feel you. You know, it's that connected disconnection almost. And so that gives us language and familiarity. And so bringing that and placing it into our prayers, placing it into what we hear, our responsive psalms throughout our services becomes a really good way to start tapping into that resource so we can learn the language and develop a relationship that we then can rely on when we are in times of grief.
Right. Yeah.
Can I say something real quick?
Go ahead, Dawn.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with what Khalia just said. And it was always interesting to me to study the Benedictine monastic tradition as a historical theologian, and just how powerful it was to invent an order of life where you give up talking, so you diminish the noise of other sounds, and then you work your way through the Psalter, I think each week, or at least each month. And I think that has such a powerful effect on shaping our emotion, our mental and emotional life spiritually. And I kind of wish we as Protestants had some way of doing that in a more disciplined way, as the monastics did, because I think that it's absolutely right. It's good to have practiced hearing these sounds, and they will come naturally to name what you experience.
You know, tying in what all of you have talked about, you know, there's a caution. I remember in seminary that when we do funerals, we should not focus so much on the hope of the resurrection and not give people a chance to do this lamenting, to do this mourning. And there's almost like a pendulum swing after the Second Vatican Council, when the liturgy of my tradition was revised, when, for example, the black vestments that were traditional for a Requiem Mass, they went away and they were replaced by white. And a lot of the symbols that we use that are unique to a funeral Mass are all taken from the baptism liturgy. So everything is the white garment. That's the pall that we put on top. We have the Paschal candle, the Easter candle that represents the light of Christ. So, but what we're doing, and part of that I think was almost a knee-jerk, I don't want to say knee-jerk reaction, but a reaction to some of maybe the overemphasis of lament. And that actually ties into the office that what you're talking about, Dawn. We clerics are obligated to do the Liturgy of the Hours every day, pray 5 times a day. That's exact monastic prayer that you're talking about. And every Friday, it's like we're commemorating Good Friday all over again, because all of the Psalms on Friday are the lament. They're the lament Psalms. The irony is, even though we do that every Friday, when you look at the lectionary texts for a funeral Mass, out of the 10 possible options for the responsorial psalm, only one is taken from the Psalms of Lament. So I only bring this up not to critique my own liturgy, which I am a big fan of, but to say, you know, there's still an unresolved tension even amongst ourselves in the way that we plan the liturgy, to give people a chance to, you know, going back to what Kevin was talking about, you know, we can't deny that the very beginnings of the church were the women and the disciples at the foot of the cross. So I mean, that was the very first mourners. Those were the very first Christians to accompany the dead and the dying, and they were accompanying our Savior. So we can't ignore that to just rush to Easter Sunday, because I think if we do, then we don't give people that opportunity to even go through all the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, but in a theological way.
You know, there is a kind of choreography to the Christian funeral service, and a certain plot. It's one of the things that bothers me about the celebration of life theme that has come into the fore, because it starts at the end, sort of at the joyous resurrection top, whereas it doesn't give you a chance to start with the lament and the dirge and the mourn, and then move gradually as you move toward the place of farewell to celebration or rejoicing. Let's change topics, because one of our participants said his or her mind was boggled when we talked about COVID and judgment in the same breath. And I think I understand, because too often the category of judgment is, as Dawn suggested, a punitive category, God from the outside reaching in to punish humanity. I'm one of the editors of the Journal for Preachers, and we asked in the middle of COVID if Walter Brueggemann would write about the notion of pandemic or the notion of plague in the Bible. And one of the things he mentioned was close to what Dawn suggests, that in the Bible there is this motif, not of a God who acts from outside, but a God who acts within creation with intentionality to set things right. And that's a form of judgment. And one of the things that Brueggemann mentioned was the knocking of human hubris off its pedestal. We've seen the global economy that we have such faith in challenged by COVID. We've seen our absolute confidence in science to solve all of our problems challenged. We've seen our isolationism challenged. And talk a little bit more about the role of judgment in the middle of a crisis like COVID.
Yeah, when I mentioned, you know, one of the things that the cross does is to relentlessly reveal the human condition of sin and brokenness. Just that kind of revelation itself is, to me, a judgment. To call a thing what it is, rather than sugarcoat it and depend on fake news and fabricate rhetoric that will make us feel good, when the cross basically says, you know what, we really need to look at our condition, and it's dire. And as Michael mentioned, yeah, you know, resurrection is impossible if we don't go through the cross. And I think as, you know, Americans, North Americans, and, you know, Doug Hall has done his life work on this, we're just not good at confronting our broken condition. We are an officially optimistic society. We are drenched in success. We think that technology will cure everything. Suffering by itself, we don't care what kind of suffering. Suffering is bad. It could be fixed, but that's just not the biblical message. There is redemptive suffering. Yes, there is destructive suffering. We need to discern that. But there is a kind of suffering that we need to go through it in order to experience hope. And I think as North Americans, we're just not good at that. Our whole society is programmed to eradicate suffering. And that's why we're just not good at dealing with situations like what we're dealing with right now. One more thing about the lament. Even that, and I think Michael mentioned it well, on Sundays, our lectionary is such that Sunday is, of course, is Resurrection Sunday. So it is edited such that the lament psalms are not there. Now, if we're following daily lectionary, yes, it's there. But the big question is, okay, well, lament is such an important part of our faith, and maybe particularly in our context. So I think there is room to include more of the lament psalms and passages and so on, because I think common understanding is that, hey, Christianity is about joy and happiness and going to heaven, and all that other stuff is just not good. Well, we look at the Bible again, and we need to teach the folks that, well, it's there, and that's another way of calling the thing what it is. And I think there's some work to do there in our liturgical life.
You know, I was chatting with my daughter about anticipating this afternoon, and she's a veterinary. She's starting a residency to become a veterinary behaviorist. And she said to me, you know, Mom, punishment from a behavioral psychology point of view is a thing that corrects the behavior. And I started to think about that, and started to think about what I mean when I say that there is divine judgment revealed in things like our experience of COVID. And I think part of it is exposing the reality and letting us see it honestly, if we will look at it, as Kevin has rightly said. But I think part of it is giving us an opportunity to think differently, to reform, to turn around, to change something. And I think that the divine judgment so-called that is built into the interconnected nature system of which we are a part is meant just for that. It is not a kind of arbitrary, capricious lashing out to hurt, but it is giving us an opportunity to see with clear eyes something that maybe we have been ignoring or denying, and then to have a chance to do it differently. And I see signs of hope, actually, as I read the American context. I think that the fact that so many people don't want to go back to work the way they did before, that's breaking something open in the American system that I think would have been very hard to break under any other circumstances. I'm not quite sure how it could have broken. So there's a gift to us given there. I think that people realizing they don't have necessarily forever, and they can't control all relevant outcomes with technology or with modern medicine or whatever. And therefore, the time with family is precious. And having it taken away for a period of time makes people more aware of how precious it is. And it's not something to postpone and put off, and so many things like that. So I do feel, I use the word judgment advisedly, and I am a theologian and not a pastoral care person. And I would never recommend going to the bedside of someone dying and talk about divine judgment, because that could only be misleading in the context. I'm talking about this on a more big picture, cultural understanding of God and God's relation to the world through COVID. And I just think it has presented us with a tremendous opportunity if we will take it. God, there is grace of God given to us in this bitter judgment.
It's a good word to end on, and we did get to some of the participants' questions and comments. I apologize for not being able to get to all of them, but we are at the end of our time. And Martin, Jean, thank you for creating, to use the language you used this afternoon, that space where we could explore these things.
Well, let me return thanks to you, Tom, and to all of our panelists, both today and in the last 3 sessions, for this ever increasingly wide-ranging conversation that we began first by simply saying to ourselves months ago, as we began planning this, that so many of the world has died in the course of this horrible pandemic. What do we have to say about that? What have we learned? So it began with a simple question like that. It expanded to also attending to those who are dying, and considering our practices as we accompany people to the end of their lives. And of course, then we had to ask the questions around the fact that this is not the first time the world has been presented with such massive loss of life, and we looked historically at this. But then today, I mean, my head is spinning through the ever increasingly wide-ranging sets of questions that you all have raised as we consider not only the ways that we face the end of our lives, but the ways that we both lament loss and grief and tragedy in the course of our lives, the way we think about the cross, our walk of faith, and of course the way we think of our lives in the world, and as we consider that the world is in fact, in a sense, dying through ecological crisis. So for all these things and many, many more, I want to offer thanks to all of you today and in the last 2 weeks, and especially to Tom, who was the chief architect with us to gather all of these voices. So thank you to all of you. And just to say to all of our listeners that these recordings will be available eventually on our website. They're gradually being processed, edited, and mounted. Look at ism.yale.edu under it's a menu off to the right now. I forget what we're calling it. Initiatives, I believe, and you'll see this 4-part webinar series eventually. The recordings thereof being released there, and they'll be up for quite some time. We hope to follow up with all of you who have registered for this session with a short questionnaire asking your opinion and also suggestions for other ways that we might gather voices in the way we've done in these 2 weeks around topics of interest and importance to everyone. So with that, in this midsummer moment, we wish everyone well, particularly those who are suffering with such incredible loss as our siblings are in Florida, and also in the Pacific Northwest and throughout North America in the face of such terrible weather. We hold you all in our prayers and hope for a better tomorrow. And for all of us, let's all continue to stay safe and well during this challenging time. Thank you all. Bye-bye.